There are moments, usually late at night, when the world feels thinner than usual, just quieter, just lighter, as if the present has loosened its grip. In those moments, the mind does something ancient. It drifts backward, not toward specific memories, but toward a feeling that time itself has been here before. Where the world you inhabit is not the first version of itself, but a continuation, warmer, slower, quieter than what came before, long before history learned how to write itself down. Before names hardened into records and dates, there were impressions, not facts. Impressions, feelings, passed from one generation to the next through tone, gesture, and silence. These impressions did not describe events clearly, they described transitions, endings that did not arrive with fire or finality, but with withdrawal. Somewhere deep in those impressions is the sense that humanity was once accompanied, not ruled, not owned, simply accompanied. The oldest stories do not speak loudly about this presence. They do not celebrate it. They do not define it clearly. Instead, they circle around it, as if the storytellers themselves were unsure how to name something that no longer stood before them, something remembered more by absence than by action. When ancient people looked backward, they did not describe a golden age of perfection. They described a time when understanding came more easily. When warnings were quieter but clearer, when knowledge seemed to arrive without force and leave without explanation. Only much later did these memories gather names. One of those names was Anunnaki. The word itself feels heavy, as though it carries sediment from a deeper layer of time. But the weight may not come from power, it may come from distance. From the effort of remembering something that was never meant to stay. What if the Anunnaki were never rulers at all? What if they were memories of teachers who chose to disappear, not vanish suddenly, not perish violently, but step back slowly, deliberately once their presence was no longer needed? If this were true, it would change the tone of every ancient story in which they appear. It would shift the focus away from control and toward transition, away from dominance and toward trust. In human experience, the most influential teachers are rarely those who remain forever. They are the ones who know when to withdraw, when to allow silence to do the work words no longer can, when to leave behind not instruction, but a responsibility. Imagine a world before this one, not technologically advanced, not divine, but deeply attentive. A world where survival depended on reading subtle changes in water, sky, and land. Where knowledge was observational, patient, earned over generations of listening. In such a world, teachers would not need authority. Their value would lie in perspective. If there were figures remembered later as the Anunnaki, perhaps they belonged to such a role, not as creators of humanity, but as witnesses to cycles humanity had not yet learned to see clearly, not as gods, but as those who had lived long enough or attentively enough to recognize when a world was nearing its close. Ancient flood traditions often begin not with chaos, but with warning, with knowledge passed quietly, instructions given without urgency, and then, remarkably, those who give the warning step out of the story. They do not remain to rule what follows. They do not oversee the rebuilding. They leave. This pattern appears again and again. Across cultures separated by oceans and time, figures arrive, teach, and then withdraw, returning to the sky, to the waters, or to realms beyond reach. Later, storytellers describe this as ascent or departure, but rarely as death. Absence without loss. This distinction matters. Lost creates grief. Absence creates memory. Memory behaves differently. It does not demand resolution. It lingers. It softens. It adapts to the needs of those who carry it forward, over generations. It sheds detail but preserves tone, and the tone preserved in these ancient stories is not fear, it is calm. Even floods, when described in their oldest forms, are not always framed as punishment. They are framed as resets, as quiet endings that clear space for continuation. Survivors are not chosen because they are favored, but because they are attentive, because they listen, because they remember. If the Anunnaki appear in these narratives, they often do so at the margins, before the flood, or just after, offering guidance and then stepping away. The world continues without them. This is not the behavior of rulers. It is the behavior of caretakers. Caretakers do not remain indefinitely. They prepare, observe, and then trust. Their greatest act is knowing when involvement would begin to interfere rather than help. Perhaps this is why the memory of the Anunnaki feels incomplete, why they are described without clarity, without consistent form or motive. Memory does not preserve what remains present, it preserves what is gone. As generations passed, humanity inherited a quieter world, a world without intermediaries, a world in which understanding had to be rediscovered rather than received. This inheritance may have felt heavy at first. The absence of guidance often does. But over time, absence sharpens awareness. Humans began to watch patterns more closely. Seasons mattered more. Water mattered more. Stories became repositories of observation rather than instruction. Knowledge was no longer given. It was earned. In this way, disappearance became a form of teaching, yet memory cannot remain unchanged forever. As societies grew larger and more complex, the need for authority grew with them. Hierarchies formed, power required justification, and ancient memories, once quiet and fluid, were reshaped to serve new structures. Teachers became rulers. Witnesses became judges. Those who withdrew were reimagined as those who ruled from afar. But even in these later versions, something restrained remains. The Anunnaki do not hover constantly. They do not intervene endlessly. They are distant, removed, present only at critical moments, and then gone again. This restraint suggests an older origin beneath the myth. It suggests that the original memory was not of domination, but of departure. If humanity had truly been ruled by beings who demanded obedience, the stories would reflect constant oversight, but they do not. They reflect a world left largely to human decision, guided only by echoes of earlier instruction. This may be the most unsettling and comforting aspect of these traditions. They do not promise return. They do not suggest rescue. They imply that guidance, once given, was meant to end. The silence that follows is not abandonment. It is trust. When ancient people told these stories at night, around low fires or beneath open skies, they were not waiting for the teachers to come back. They were remembering how the world felt before responsibility fully settled on human shoulders, the calm before independence, the moment just after guidance fades. That feeling survives more clearly than any detail. It survives floods, collapses, migrations. It survives because it addresses something fundamental, the transition from being guided to guiding oneself. If the Anunnaki were memories of teachers who chose to disappear, then their legacy is not power, but space. Space for humanity to make mistakes, to forget, to rediscover, to build meaning without supervision. In the long quiet after their departure, humanity did not collapse. It continued. And in continuing, it fulfilled whatever trust had been placed in it. This interpretation does not ask to be believed. It asks only to be considered slowly, without urgency. Like the stories themselves, it unfolds best in stillness, in the moments when the present loosens and the past drifts closer, not as fact, but as feeling. And in that feeling, the Anunnaki remain, not as gods, not as rulers, but as the memory of a hand that once guided, and then gently let go. The letting go did not happen all at once. No memory ever suggests that it did. There is no single night in which the teachers vanished, no final gathering, no closing words preserved in stone. Instead, what lingers is the sense of a gradual thinning, a presence that became less frequent, guidance that arrived less directly, questions that were no longer answered immediately, if at all. For those living through it, the change may have felt subtle, at first hardly noticeable, a longer pause before instruction, a gesture instead of an explanation, a silence where once there had been a voice. Only later, in reflection, would the shift become clear. Human memory often works this way. We rarely recognize the moment something ends. We recognize it afterward, when the pattern no longer returns. In the generations following the disappearance, humanity began to experience time differently. Without teachers close at hand, the future became less certain, but more open. Decisions carried weight. Actions produced consequences that could not be corrected by an external authority. Learning became slower, but deeper. This may be why early traditions place such importance on observation, on watching the movement of stars, the rise and fall of waters, the behavior of animals, the subtle changes in wind and soil. Knowledge no longer arrived from outside. It had to be gathered patiently, often over lifetimes. Stories became the vessels for this gathering. Not stories of conquest or triumph, but stories of endings survived, of worlds that shifted quietly without announcing themselves, of floods that did not simply destroy but transformed, of teachers who did not punish failure but withdrew when teaching was complete. These stories were not told to frighten, they were told to steady, to remind listeners that change had happened before and that survival did not require dominance, only attention. If the Anunnaki appear within these stories, they do so without urgency. They do not rush humanity. They do not demand acceleration. They seem aware that time itself is the teacher now. That repetition will do what instruction once did. And so, they fade. In some accounts, they retreat upward. In others, they withdraw into distant lands or vanish beneath the waters. These images may differ, but the emotional tone remains consistent. There is no panic in their leaving, no struggle, no resistance, only distance. Distance transforms memory. As centuries passed, distance turned familiarity into reverence. Reverence turned into structure. Structure into belief. Belief into doctrine. But beneath these layers, the original feeling of calm departure endured. This endurance is important. It suggests that the memory was not shaped primarily by fear. Fear tends to exaggerate. It sharpens edges. It accelerates narratives toward catastrophe. But these ancient stories remain measured. They move slowly, even when describing collapse. Such pacing is unusual for myths invented purely to command obedience. It feels more like recollection of a time when the world itself seemed to understand cycles better than humans did, when endings were anticipated rather than resisted, when disappearance was not equated with failure. If the teachers knew that a great change was coming, whether environmental, social, or both, they may have understood that remaining would interfere with adaptation. Guidance suited to one world can become a burden in another. To cling to it is to prevent growth. So they stepped back. This withdrawal placed humanity in a difficult position. Without constant instruction, people had to interpret old knowledge under new conditions. They had to decide which lessons still applied and which no longer fit the reshaped world. Mistakes were inevitable, but mistakes are teachers of their own. Over time, humanity learned not just survival, but interpretation. It learned how to carry meaning forward even when context was lost. This skill, the ability to preserve essence while allowing form to change, may be one of the most important inheritances from that earlier age. It is reflected in the myths themselves, though details vary. core themes remain remarkably consistent across cultures. The presence of an earlier world, the occurrence of a great transition, the survival of a few, the withdrawal of guiding figures, the continuation of humanity alone. These are not stories of rescue. They are stories of succession. In succession, the one who leaves does not return. The error is complete. The next phase belongs to those who remain. This understanding may explain why ancient traditions rarely express hope for the return of the teachers. There is longing, yes, curiosity, wonder, but not expectation. The tone is reflective, not anticipatory. Modern interpretations often struggle with this. We are accustomed to narratives of return, of lost figures, who come back to restore order, but the oldest layers do not promise restoration. They accept continuity instead. Continuity without supervision. This acceptance is quietly radical. It places responsibility squarely on humanity without comfort or threat. It suggests that the world does not wait for external correction. It unfolds according to cycles that must be learned, not avoided. If the Anunnaki were memories of teachers who chose to disappear, then their disappearance was not abandonment but completion. A final act that trusted humanity to carry forward what could no longer be taught directly. Memory alone cannot preserve everything. It forgets details. It reshapes motives. It simplifies complexity. But it preserves orientation. It tells future generations how to stand in relation to the past. And the orientation preserved here is one of humility. Humanity is not at the center of time. It is within time. It inherits worlds shaped before it and leaves worlds reshaped behind. Guidance may arrive at critical moments, but it does not linger forever. This perspective may have offered comfort to those living after catastrophe, to survivors standing amid altered landscapes, uncertain whether stability would ever return. The stories reminded them that others had faced similar endings and that continuation was possible without divine oversight. In telling these stories softly, often at night, ancient people were not worshiping the past. They were learning how to live with it. They learned that some presences are felt most strongly after they are gone, that influence does not require permanence, that disappearance can be an act of care rather than neglect. Over generations, the Anunnaki became less distinct. Their names shifted, their roles blurred. In some cultures, they were absorbed into larger pantheons. In others, they became ancestral figures or distant judges. But always, they remained removed, never fully present, never fully gone. This liminal state, half remembered, half myth, mirrors the transition they may represent, the moment between guidance and independence, between accompaniment and solitude. It is a moment humanity has never fully left behind. Even now, there is a tendency to search for external authority, to look upward or backward for answers, to imagine that guidance must come from outside rather than within, the slow accumulation of experience. But the oldest stories do not encourage this search. They suggest that guidance has already been given, that what remains is interpretation, not instruction. The Anunnaki, in this sense, are not mysteries to be solved. They are reminders of a responsibility accepted long ago. A responsibility to observe carefully, to adapt patiently, to remember without certainty. As sleep deepens and the mind drifts, this idea does not ask for agreement. It asks only for stillness, for the willingness to let ambiguity remain unresolved. Because unresolved memory is not empty, it is fertile. It allows each generation to discover meaning suited to its own world, rather than clinging to forms shaped by another. It allows the past to inform without controlling, to guide without governing. If the teachers had remained, humanity might never have learned this balance. Dependence might have replaced awareness. Certainty might have replaced curiosity. By disappearing, they allowed something more durable to emerge, not obedience, understanding. Understanding that the world changes, that guidance fades, that memory endures imperfectly, and that within this imperfection lies the freedom to continue. When the ancient storytellers spoke of those who left, they did not speak in anger. They spoke with a quiet acceptance, as if they understood, even if they could not explain, that the departure had been necessary, that necessity still echoes not as command, not as promise, but as space. And within that space, humanity continues to learn, slowly, imperfectly, alone, yet never entirely unprepared. The space left behind by their departure did not remain empty for long. Human life, like water, flows into whatever shape is available to it. Where guidance once stood, interpretation emerged. Where instruction had been given, meaning was slowly constructed through repetition, error, and adjustment. This process was not dramatic, it was gradual, unfolding across lifetimes rather than moments. Children were born who never experienced the presence their elders spoke of. For them, the teachers existed only as stories softly told, never precise. These children listened not for detail, but for feeling. They learned how the stories were spoken, slowly, respectfully, often at night. They sensed that the stories were not meant to instruct them directly, but to orient them. Orientation matters more than answers. It teaches where to stand, not what to think. In this way, the memory of the teachers did not produce obedience. It produced attentiveness. It taught people to notice signs rather than commands, patterns rather than rules. When the land shifted, they watched. When the waters rose, they remembered that others had faced such change before. When certainty dissolved, they turned inward and toward one another. This collective attentiveness became culture. Culture formed not as a replacement for guidance, but as its echo. It held together what could no longer be delivered directly. Songs carried season knowledge, rituals preserved timing, myths encoded warnings in metaphor rather than instruction. Nothing was explicit because explicitness had passed with the teachers. This indirect transmission allowed knowledge to survive change. Direct instruction is fragile. It depends on context, but metaphor adapts, it bends. It reshapes itself to fit new landscapes, new climates, new ways of life. The teachers may have understood this. They may have known that the most durable guidance is the kind that does not insist on being understood immediately. And so, they left behind stories rather than systems. As time went on, these stories grew older than their tellers. They accumulated layers. Each generation added its own interpretations, its own concerns. Over time, the teachers became distant figures, associated with beginnings rather than transitions. Their departure was remembered, but its meaning blurred. Yet one thing remained unchanged: they did not stay. This absence continued to shape the moral tone of the stories. Even as societies grew more complex, even as power structures hardened, the memory of departure lingered as a counterbalance. It reminded people, subtly, persistently, that no authority is permanent. Kings ruled, but they fell. Cities rose, but they were abandoned. Laws were written, but they changed. And beyond all of this, the teachers remained absent. This absence prevented the past from becoming absolute. It left room for change. It ensured that no system could claim to be final, because the figures associated with ultimate authority had chosen not to remain. In this way, the disappearance of the teachers may have protected humanity from stagnation. Stagnation is often born of certainty, the belief that the present form is the correct and permanent one. But ancient memory, shaped by disappearance, resists this belief. It carries within it the understanding that forms pass, even when they feel stable. The Anunnaki remembered through this lens, are not symbols of lost perfection. They are symbols of impermanence. Handled gently, they represent a world that ended without collapse, a transition completed without domination. This interpretation shifts the emotional center of ancient flood traditions. Instead of focusing on destruction, it emphasizes continuity. The flood becomes not an erasure of failure, but a boundary between phases, a line crossed quietly without return. Those who survived were not chosen to restore the past. They were chosen, or found themselves compelled, to continue without it. The teachers did not return after the flood because return would have contradicted the lesson. The new world required new understanding. Old guidance would have misaligned with changed conditions. By staying away, the teachers allowed humanity to recalibrate. This recalibration was slow and uneven. It involved loss, confusion, and forgetting. But it also involved creativity. New ways of living emerged. New stories formed. Humanity did not simply preserve the past, it transformed it. In this transformation, memory served as a compass rather than a map. It pointed toward attentiveness, humility, and patience. It did not specify destinations. Perhaps this is why the memory of the teachers feels unfinished. Why it resists closure. It was never meant to conclude with certainty. It was meant to remain open, adaptable, unresolved. Unresolved memory invites participation. Each generation must interpret it anew, must decide what it means in their own time, must extract relevance without instruction. This process keeps the memory alive without freezing it. If the teachers had remained present, memory might have hardened into doctrine. Their words might have been preserved verbatim, repeated without reflection. Instead, absence forced interpretation. Interpretation forced engagement. Engagement created continuity. In the quiet after the teacher departure, humanity learned how to carry the weight of time. It learned that guidance does not eliminate uncertainty. It prepares one to live within it. It learned that survival is not about control, but about responsiveness. These lessons do not announce themselves. They are absorbed gradually through repetition and reflection. They surface most clearly in moments of stillness, when the present loosens and the past drifts closer, not as instruction, but as reassurance. Reassurance that endings have been survived before, that absence is not emptiness, that responsibility, once accepted, becomes a source of stability rather than fear. As the centuries passed, the memory of the teachers receded further into myth. Their names changed, their stories fragmented. In some places, they were remembered as judges of the dead, in others as distant ancestors or cosmic figures. These variations matter less than the shared tone. Hair always removed, always observing, if at all, from a distance. Never directly involved in daily life. This distance suggests that the most important aspect of their legacy was not what they did, but what they chose not to do. They chose not to remain. They chose not to govern indefinitely. They chose not to correct every mistake. In doing so, they allowed humanity to develop its own memory, its own rhythm, its own relationship with time. This relationship is imperfect. It includes repetition of errors, cycles of forgetting and rediscovery, but it is human. And perhaps that was the intention. If the teachers had intended to create permanence, they would have stayed. If they had intended to rule, they would have enforced. Instead, they withdrew, leaving behind a world capable of change. The Anunnaki, remembered as teachers who chose to disappear, become symbols not of lost power, but of completed responsibility. They remind us that guidance, when given well, eventually makes itself unnecessary. As sleep deepens, this idea settles gently. It does not demand interpretation, It does not insist on belief. It simply rests like an old memory whose details have faded but whose feeling remains intact. A feeling of having been prepared, a feeling of having been trusted, a feeling that the world, though uncertain, has carried uncertainty before. In this feeling, the past does not pull us backward. It steadies us. It reminds us that humanity has always lived in the space between guidance and independence, that this space is not a failure, but a condition, and within this condition, life continues, quietly, imperfectly, attentively, shaped, not by the presence of teachers, but by the memory of their departure. As the generations stretched onward, the memory of disappearance became so deeply woven into human understanding that it no longer felt like loss. It felt like background, like the quiet presence of gravity, unseen, unquestioned, shaping everything without demanding attention. Humanity learned to live inside that quiet, without teachers standing nearby. People learned to measure time by return rather than instruction. The return of seasons, the return of stars to familiar positions, the return of floods, droughts, and renewal. These returns did not promise stability, but they offered rhythm, and rhythm, once recognized, becomes a form of knowledge. The earliest communities learned that no voice would intervene if the rhythm was ignored. Crops failed when signs were misread. Settlements vanished when water was misunderstood. Memory hardened around these lessons, not as rules imposed from above, but as consequences observed from within. This kind of learning is slow, but it lasts. It creates cultures that do not expect rescue, cultures that watch carefully, cultures that understand that continuity is not guaranteed, but earned through attentiveness. The memory of the teachers, now distant, abstract, hovered behind this awareness, not as authority, but as precedent. They had left, and yet the world continued. In this continuation, humanity may have discovered something the teachers themselves already understood, that endurance does not come from control, but from adaptability, that a world constantly managed becomes brittle, that a world allowed to respond freely becomes resilient. The stories preserved from the ancient past seem to know this intuitively. They do not linger on the moment of departure, they do not dramatize it. Instead, they move on, as life does. They describe what came after, the long work of rebuilding, the quiet labor of remembering enough, but not too much. Too much memory can trap a people in imitation. Too little can leave them unmoored. The balance lies between, perhaps, the teachers withdrew to protect this balance. Perhaps they understood that their continued presence would freeze memory in place, that reverence would replace responsiveness, that humanity would look backward instead of outward. By leaving, they ensured that memory remained incomplete. Incomplete memory requires participation. It requires imagination, interpretation, and choice. It cannot simply be obeyed, it must be lived with. This may explain why ancient stories feel unfinished even now. They do not resolve neatly, they trail off. They gesture rather than conclude. They leave space for the listener to continue the thought. In this way, the stories behave like the teachers themselves. They guide and then they step back. Over time, humanity grew comfortable with this pattern. The absence of external guidance became normal. The responsibility to decide, to observe, to remember became part of what it meant to be human. Even when later societies constructed gods who ruled absolutely, even when authority was projected outward once again, the oldest layer of memory remained quietly skeptical. It reminded listeners that even the greatest powers fade, that nothing remains indefinitely, that permanence is an illusion created by short perspective. This skepticism is subtle but persistent. It surfaces in stories where gods withdraw after creation, where divine figures set events in motion and then recede, where humanity is left to face consequences without intervention. These are not comforting narratives in the conventional sense, but they are stabilizing. They do not promise rescue. They promise continuity. If the Anunnaki were remembered as teachers who chose to disappear, then their greatest influence may be this quiet realism, the understanding that no one else will finish the work, that the world, once entrusted, remains entrusted. This understanding does not diminish humanity, it situates it. It places human life within a longer arc, where guidance is occasional and temporary, and responsibility is constant, where wisdom is not inherited fully formed, but assembled slowly from fragments, like stories, fragments like rituals, fragments like the feeling that the world has ended before and will end again, and that endings are not always violent. Sometimes they are gentle, a shoreline shifting, a river changing course, a presence fading. Such endings leave fewer traces but deeper ones. They teach not through shock but through adaptation. As centuries turned into millennia, the memory of the teachers became something closer to atmosphere than narrative. It shaped expectations without being consciously recalled. It influenced how people understood authority, change, and time itself. Even today, traces of this inheritance remain. In moments of uncertainty, there is often a sense, not always articulated, that no external voice will arrive with answers, that solutions must be found through observation, cooperation, patience, that the past can inform, but not decide. This sense may be the quiet echo of that ancient departure, not a warning, not a promise, but a condition. To live without constant guidance is not to live abandoned. It is to live entrusted, entrusted with attention, entrusted with memory, entrusted with the continuation of a story that no longer explains itself. In this light, the Anunnaki do not need to be explained away or elevated. They can be understood as symbols of a moment, when guidance knew its limits, when teaching reached its natural end. They did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they had succeeded enough. Their withdrawal allowed humanity to become fully itself, not perfected, not enlightened, but responsible for interpretation, responsible for adaptation, responsible for remembering not exactly what was but how it felt, to stand at the edge of change and continue anyway. As the night deepens and thought slows, this perspective settles quietly. It does not demand belief. It does not insist on resolution. It simply offers a way of holding ancient memory without turning it into certainty, a way of listening without expecting instruction, a way of remembering without waiting for return. The world we inhabit now is quieter than the one remembered in myth, not because it lacks meaning, but because meaning is no longer given directly. It must be discovered, shaped, and reshaped as conditions change. This is not a loss. It is an inheritance passed down, not through presence, but through absence, not through command, but through trust. If the Anunnaki were memories of teachers who chose to disappear, then their final lesson was not how to survive a flood, or how to build a city, or how to read the sky. Their final lesson was how to continue without them. And humanity, imperfectly but persistently, has been answering that lesson ever since.